Here's the United States. They talk about 4 assurance and a 5th assurance, so I've just summarized that as the 5 assurances. I mentioned the national standards. It's a big thing for the United States to develop common standards in maths, science and English across all 50 states. It's never happened before. It's a big challenge. They're working it through. They're working on a common assessment system across the 50 states. Again, a huge, unprecedented challenge for a country in which states' rights has been a very powerful strand of politics since its creation 200 and more years ago. Then, so the second assurance they look for is strengthening teacher quality, using the data that I mentioned, that's the third point here, to influence the way in which they train, develop their teaching professions. Really good developments, often from a low base actually in the United States, to strengthen teacher quality. The data systems I've mentioned, they have a lot of seriously underperforming urban high schools, which again are firmly on the agenda, with each state or city, depending on the constitution in the state, thinking through how to turn around those deeply challenged and troubled schools. But we will see real progress in the US. The reason I mention this is the 4 or 5 things on here relate very clearly to the 9 boxes I just showed you. So obviously it's all in the detail, but nevertheless you could argue, I think quite convincingly, that Arne Duncan, the American Secretary of Education, has a broadly evidence-based position on policy and is making progress with it. Certainly it's the best opportunity to reform American schools for 2 or 3 decades. And then at the other end of the spectrum, take Pakistan. Again, this was mentioned in the citation where I've been spending a week every 6 weeks since last December. Pakistan has a really troubled education system. It's one of the most challenged education systems in the world. Only under two-thirds of children are in school at all. Of those that do attend, for 100 that start school age 5, only 1 will still be in school age 16. And then if you look at what they actually learn after 3 years, those who attend elementary school for 3 years, about 35% of them can't do single-digit subtraction. So this is a very challenged system. The reason I want to mention it here, and I can't go through all the details of this, is if you look through the various factors there, again, this is the national education policy that Pakistan is now seeking to implement to change the circumstances that I've just described. Again, you'll see they're firmly based on the 9 boxes that I mentioned before: the setting of standards, the development of teachers and leaders, and so on. So I mentioned this in passing, not to spend time on it now, to say that if you take this growing body of evidence about what system reform looks like, about what effective systems look like and how systems become effective, and apply them to any country in the world, there's a much better chance than we've had in the past of reforming systems successfully. I think for too long we've thought, when we think about reforming education systems, that it's just too big a task, too daunting. Some of us maybe thought like that Russian Prime Minister who resigned after a year in office in 1995 and said, "We tried to do better, but everything turned out as usual." We can't afford it to turn out as usual this time. Of course, there are many, many things that we don't know about system reform. Some of you might remember, or might prefer to forget, I'm not sure, Donald Rumsfeld and his famous garbled remarks about the known knowns and the known unknowns. The 9 boxes are the known knowns. There are some known unknowns which are relevant here. I gave you my interpretation with the formula of what the 21st century curriculum should be, but that's certainly a debate. Not everybody would agree with me. I wouldn't expect them to agree with me. It's a debate they're having most vigorously in Alberta in Canada, in my familiarity, or Australia right now. But it's a really important debate. What is, if we ask the question here, Britain's place in the world? How do we want to prepare children for that? Secondly, the human capital model, the way in which we use people in schools, ought to be changing significantly as we combine technology, newly skilled teachers, newly skilled other staff, and mix them in different ways. Some of the most innovative head teachers in this country are doing that very thing. it's a different set of circumstances from when the College of Teachers was founded. And around the world, we see experimentation on that, but we don't see yet, I think, convincing evidence of what there won't be one right model, but of what the most effective models are for mixing different types of staff and technology. There was a debate yesterday, wasn't there, about the police force. Some police forces in this country now employ more civilians than police. The first reaction to that is that sounds like a lot of bureaucrats, but if they're forensic scientists or a range of other specialists, maybe that's the right thing. But either way, it's the same debate playing itself out in the policing circumstances. There's the question of how we relate school and out of school. The Duke of Edinburgh's Award, which was mentioned earlier, fantastic experiment, and some schools have done a wonderful job of connecting their formal curriculum to their out-of-school curriculum, using that as an overarching model. But what are the models that connect learning at school to learning in formal settings out of school to learning at home in coherent ways, so that the children are getting K plus T plus L, or in a bracket E, in all of those circumstances, not just during the school day? What does that look like? Then there's knowledge management. We've been very, very poor as educators collectively, I think, about gathering our knowledge and applying it systematically, about having centres of knowledge. The Institute of Education actually over the last decade has made real contribution in this area, but there's much more to do to get the knowledge quickly and easily accessible to the people who need it when they need it, in the way that you see in many other lines of work. And technology, I list there just as an enabler of all the things that I've just mentioned. If I can finish, this is my favourite of the slides. This is Annapurna, the first 8,000-metre peak that human beings climbed in 1950. I walked round it 2 years ago. I hasten to add, round it, not up it. It is absolutely spectacular, as you can see. The team that first climbed it was a French team led by a man called Maurice Herzog. And it was a heroic climb, and if any of you ever find the book, I commend it to you. It was desperate. They got to the top. Maurice Herzog and one other colleague made it to the top, and then shortly after he'd left the top, he dropped a glove, which is a pretty devastating thing to do at 25,000 feet high. He began to get frostbite. The other guy got injured, and they got down very, very slowly to a fairly high camp. And then even more and more slowly that to be carried later on, literally losing fingers and toes as they came down. And Maurice Herzog wrote this wonderful book of this, and the very last line of the book is, "There are other Annapurnas in the lives of people," which I think is a very beautiful line. He actually went on to become a Minister of Culture and found his own other Annapurnas in his future life. I think successful education system reform is our collective Annapurna for the next decade. I hope that we don't lose our fingers and toes in taking it on, but we have to do effective education system reform, not just here, but right around the world, quite quickly, I think, if we're to enable the children that I pictured at the beginning of this presentation to learn what they will need to learn to rise to the challenge of the 21st century. I think as a result of the developments in knowledge, many of them undertaken at this institute here, we are at base camp. We're beginning to know what we need to do to reform education systems successfully. Now the challenge is to actually go about doing it. And the question for us is, do we have the courage, the persistence and the ambition to ascend right to the top of Annapurna and not just to walk around it? Thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you.